Welcome to the Tom Twomey Series and tonight's presentation, Landmarks and Legends, East Hampton Unveiled. I'm Steve Long, Executive Director of the East Hampton Historical Society, and so pleased to welcome all of you this evening. The Historical Society is thrilled to co-present this year's series with the East Hampton Library. And I want to give special thanks to Dennis, the library's director, and Andrea, curator of the library's Long Island collection, for being just such great partners, so much fun to work with. So big round of applause for those folks. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, David Cataletto. An East Hampton native and dedicated educator, David teaches history and English at East Hampton Middle School. There he channels student energy, including my own son and some students that we have here of David's, into local causes, running 2 community service clubs, Do Good, Be Good, and Surf Rider. And beyond the classroom, David is deeply engaged in the preservation and stewardship of East Hampton. He serves as an East Hampton Town Trustee, chairs the Education Committee at the historic Amagansett Life-Saving Station Museum, is a member of the East Hampton Historical Society's Education Committee, and is a trustee for the East Hampton Town Nature Preserve Committee. Wow. Amazing, all that. Liz, where So please, a big round of applause for David Cataletto.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Steve. Good evening.
Good evening.
All right, so nice to see so many people here tonight and on such a cold night. It's an honor to be speaking here tonight, starting this lecture series, and I'm really honored. So at the East Hampton Middle School, I teach ancient civilizations. And one of the central questions students wrestle with is deceptively a simple one. How does geography affect people? We study the Fertile Crescent, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River valleys, and then the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Water, soil, climate, and terrain don't just influence civilizations, they quietly determine them. And we're no different here in East Hampton. Our beaches, bays, ponds, harbors, wind, and soil have shaped how people lived, worked, traveled, and survived, even long before the first English or Dutch colonists arrived. If I tried to cover every place name in East Hampton, we'd be here all week, right? So let's skip the obvious ones like Pond View or Bluff Road or Long Lane. Instead, we'll take a broad, sweeping journey from Sagaponack to Montauk, pausing at places that are intriguing, revealing, and sometimes overlooked. Before I go any further, I should say this. I did consult with Hugh King, and Hugh in his usual, And Hugh in his usual wisdom gave me very clear guidance. I was like, Hugh, which place names? He says, David, talk about the names you want. So if I skip your favorite road, cove, or beach, I apologize, and you're welcome to take it up with Hugh. He's right up here. Speaking of Hugh, my friend and mentor, who, by the way, has a street named after him, and if you haven't found it yet, keep your eyes peeled because it's not too far from here. He also taught me that every good talk at the end should have a quiz. So no more shopping on Amazon, Liz. All right, tonight we'll take a look at the familiar with X-ray vision. We drive these roads, walk these beaches, and say their names every day without a second thought. Tonight is not meant to be just a list of names. It's an attempt to uncover the deep, layered history cut directly into the landscape itself. from Montauk people to African and European influence. These names tell us who lived here, how they understood this place, and if we're honest, something about who we still are. So I'd like to open up with a poem written in 1926 by George Asa Miller, who lived in Springs and served on the town board. The poem is called Town Meeting. And see how many place names you recognize in it. The first Tuesday of April brings remembrances keen of former things, of privilege and right. Hark back with me over 50 years, and list what look like a dream appears, a medley of the night. This day East Hampton's freemen meet, as by East Hampton's patent sheet, their sires were bound to do. Erect and unafraid they come, from modest, proud, or humble home. No man can say them no. From Springs and Kingstown, through the sand, East Side, Barnes Hole, and Stony Hill, Montauk, Napig, and Promised Land, Fresh Pond, the Scrubs, and Whippoorwill. The Amagansett whalemen come, Skimhampton Road, and Further Lane, and every man who makes his home twixt Littleworth and Eastern Plain. From Fireplace, Duck Creek, Harbor Head, Round Swamp, Freetown, and Northwest Plains, Hardscrabble, Toilsome, Gingerbread, Race, Buell, Woods, and Newtown Lanes, Sag Harbor and its Ships Ahoy, and Northwest Creek and Powder Hill, the Hollow and the Whooping Boy, and Nineveh and Snookersville, from Wainscott, Buckskill, and the Creeks, from Appoquog and Jericho, from Lazy Point and Nominix, Georgica, Egypt, and Pantago, from Cedar Point and Ellybrook, Hands Creek, Soak Hides, and Sammy's Beach, from Accabonac and the Hook, from every place in sound or reach. If not too rough to keep afloat, there surely comes the island boat. They all foregather in the street, old times recall, old comrades greet, old shipmates from the sea, till in the old academy, Squire Tuthill stands in dignity, and thrice calls out, "Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye!" And that these freemen gather round, and move in second at the sound, or sign of old N.D. They often argue, sometimes fight, some always disagree, but still in all, or wrong or right, they are one family. Great. A lot of familiar names. Okay, so to keep us organized tonight, we'll look at East Hampton place names through two lenses. First, indigenous Algonquin names, and second, colonial names and what comes after. All right, here we go. Those who know me know I like to start at the beginning, the real beginning. So bear with me for a moment. Many of you already know this, but it's worth saying it aloud. The first men and women to arrive here didn't come by boat, horse, wagon, or even the jitney. 12,000 years ago, people walked. They followed migrating herds of mammoth and prehistoric bison across the landscape that would be almost unrecognizable to us today. Long Island Sound, for example, was then a massive freshwater lake, while just to the north, mile-high glacial ice covered what is now Connecticut. Even today, fishermen still occasionally haul up woolly mammoth tusks in their nets, a reminder that the deep past is still very much beneath us. Over thousands of years, animal trails became footpaths. Footpaths became traveled routes, and those routes quietly became the backbone of our road system today, long before anyone complained of traffic. The oldest place names we still use in East Hampton come from the Algonquin languages of southern New England, primarily the Montaukett and the Shinnecock dialects. And as you'll begin to notice, these early names almost never honor individuals. They don't commemorate landowners or prominent families or anyone with good connections. Instead, indigenous names describe the land itself, what it looked like, how it behaved, and how people lived with it. Naming was not an act of ownership. It was an act of attention, of understanding, and of connection to a place that I would argue is a lesson still worth learning. Before we start moving east, we need to step back and look at the island as a whole. The Montauk word for Long Island was Paumanok. Say it with me, Paumanok. The name means land of tribute. The tribute was wampum, crafted here primarily from clamshells, carefully drilled, polished, and shaped into purple and white beads. Montauk wampum was so highly valued that it was paid as tribute to more powerful northern tribes such as the Pequots and the Narragansetts, so they wouldn't raid here. In fact, Montauk wampum has been found as far as the Great Lakes and the Rocky Mountains. In other words, the paths that began here in Paumanok didn't just cross the island, they radiated outward across the continent. Long before Wall Street, this island was an economic powerhouse. This map shows the names of roughly 13 bands or peoples that made up Paumanok during colonial times, and some I'm sure you recognize, like Setauket, Merrick, Massapequa, Rockaways, Canarsie. All right, so now let's begin from the west. Sagaponack translates as the place to dig for groundnuts. These tubers, think of them as wild, protein-rich potatoes, were a vital staple for Montaukets and remarkably nutritious. Once abundant, this superfood is now rarely found. The tubers themselves are inedible unless cooked, so these were buried in the warm coals of a fire and slowly roasted until their nutrients and they would become palatable, a process that required time, patience, and knowledge. At the height of this culture, the Montaukett or Shinnecock, worth his weight, could identify hundreds of plant species, knowing which are edible, medicinal, useful for building, or better left alone, and exactly when each should be harvested. Just as important, they understood restraint, always leaving enough behind to regenerate for the next season. Even Sag Harbor takes its name from this root. Originally Sagaponack Harbor, it eventually shortened to Sag Harbor, or if we're being honest about translation, we can just call it Groundnut Harbor. That name never really caught on. I don't know if it ever will. All right, I'm going to jump to Springs in Accabonac Harbor. Like Sagaponack, Accabonac is tied to the harvesting of these groundnuts. So Ponic and Bonic come from that Algonquin word groundnut. You with me? All right, so Boniker could actually translate to native potato. Early regulations eventually restricted Native Americans from harvesting groundnuts on lands claimed by the colonists. Over time, this dependable food source was plowed under or over-harvested until basic extinction. Moving east, we come to Poxabog. Yes, the name of a golf course today and a top-notch breakfast spot. Poxabog originally meaning the pond that widens. So Poxabog Golf Course, if you go west on 27, you're going to hit the pond. And remarkably, it still does. It widens during heavy rains, and the pond it expands during dry spells. It contracts. The name remains as accurate today as it was centuries ago. At first, quick fun fact. At first nearby house, the first nearby house, built in 1712 by Edward Howell, son of Ezekiel Howell, the man who built the original bridge over Sag Pond along Sagaponack Road, and in doing so, accidentally named Bridgehampton. Buckskill Road carries one of the most solemn stories we have. The name Buckskill means resting place. In 1651, Pagatuck, leader of the Manhasset tribe of Shelter Island and brother to the Sachem Wyandanch, died. His body was carried east to Montauk for burial. Along the way, the procession stopped and his body rested at what we now call Buckskill. There's a historical marker right there on 114, noting the event. The sacred spot was paved over to make way for 114. I drive that road almost every day, and sometimes I find myself imagining that quiet, regal procession moving through those same woods. Georgia Pond and road and beach are likely derived from Georgia Key. Georgia Key was a famous Montaukett who lived and fished and traveled those waters around Georgia for many years. He was said to be an expert whaler and coveted for shore whaling. And remember, whaling was East Hampton's first major industry, taking it from a colony that was not just surviving but thriving with whale oil exports. In Springs, Ashawa means land between the branches of a creek, or simply the meeting place, a perfect name for a site that continues to serve that purpose today. The current Ashawa Hall began as a school in the 1800s, another reminder that the landscape itself has always shaped how people gather. Copices Lane translates to a small harbor or a place shut in. You can still just glimpse 3 Mile Harbor through those houses and trees. Flaggy Hole Road takes its name from cattails. Cattails look like flags, whose flexible stems and leaves were woven by native peoples into wigwams, mats, baskets. Less obvious, but just as important, were the roots. They were edible, highly nutritious. You'll notice there are several places on the South Fork that include flag and flaggy. There's no coincidence. You can safely assume these locations were near fresh water, which was as valuable then as it is now. Sadly, invasive Phragmites has overtaken much of our wetlands, and cattails, once common, have become increasingly rare in East Hampton. It's also worth correcting a common assumption. Early native peoples were not primarily hunters. Roughly 70% of Montaukett Shinnecock food came from gathering and farming. Between ground nuts and cattail roots, chestnuts and walnuts, berries, beach plums, and abundance of shellfish, oysters, clams, scallops, not to mention agriculture, including the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash. There was little need to rely heavily on hunting. The land we live on today was once a true cornucopia of food and materials. It didn't just support life, it rewarded those who understood it. Amagansett comes from the Algonquin for place of good fishing. Offshore and shore fishing and whaling were happening here long before European records ever mentioned it. Another reason early fishermen might have located here was a reliable drinking source right near the beach. Today we call this Indian Wells. Indian Wells comes from the fact that there were at least 3 prolific freshwater springs near the sea of Amagansett. Native Americans used those springs for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Those freshwater springs are first mentioned in the town records in 1652. Monacoma Lane, running from Amagansett Main Street to Bluff Road, crossed land owned by the Baker family, one of the first 4 English families to settle Amagansett. Monacoma is generally understood to mean assembly place. I might be pronouncing that wrong. Okay, next we sweep eastward to Napig, from Napog, meaning land overflowed by water. If you've ever tried getting through Napig during a hurricane or a nor'easter, you already know the Montauketts got that exactly right. And we all know the story of how Montauk became an island during the hurricane of 38. And that was nicknamed the Long Island Express. In many ways, our knowledge today of native words might not be possible without William Wallace Tooker, 1848 to 1917. Tooker was a Sag Harbor historian, anthropologist, dedicated archivist, and linguist who spent his life carefully recording and preserving native place names. At a time when many were being forgotten or mispronounced beyond recognition, William Wallace Tooker's groundbreaking book, The Indian Place Names of Long Island, came out in 1911. I used a lot of his research for this. Okay, east to Montauk. Okay, Montauk. The words Montaukett or Montauk often are interpreted as the fortified land, a reference to the great Montaukett fort that was still standing there as late as 1662. This was not at the edge of the world. It was an important stronghold, a place of defense, trade, and authority. Just east of Eastlake lies Indian Field, home to a Montauk cemetery and a landscape, to me at least, still feels quietly alive with memory. Nearby is Massacre Valley, you may have heard of, the site of a violent attack by the Narragansetts during the wedding of Sachem Wyandanch's daughter. 30 Montauk warriors were killed, 13 young women were taken captive, including the bride. An event that reshaped alliances and power across that region for decades. Near the lighthouse, Shagwan Point, originally Shagwanaconic, means place on the hill. As with many indigenous words, English speakers struggled with pronunciation or became lazy and eventually simplified it. What a surprise. So it became Shagwan. Wigwams once stood on that hillside, a spot that would be a perfect lookout for enemy canoes paddling across from the Sound from Narragansett, or a high ground to spot migrating whales. I came to understand many of these Native American words while researching my historical fiction novel, Kings of the Coast. Okay, now we surge forward into colonial times, when the English and Dutch arrived, bringing with them deeds, property lines, and long-standing habit of naming places after themselves or the towns they left behind. It was around 400 years ago, with the arrival of horses and wider wagons, that those ancient footprints finally began to widen into something we might recognize today as roads. When it was first established in 1648, East Hampton was called Maidstone, after a town in Kent, England, from which many of the earliest settlers originated. The name Hampton comes from Old English. Ham means a home or a homestead, often tied to pasture land, and ton means a town or settlement. So if you put it together, Hampton translate roughly to homestead town or pasture settlement, which, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense for a place that began not as a resort, but as a working landscape shaped by fields, animals, and people who expected the land to earn its keep. At the time, we were, of course, a colony, and the Crown's expectations were fairly clear: make the land productive and ideally profitable. The early colonial government, and later the East Hampton trustees, were tasked with settling the land, building roads, encouraging agriculture, and attracting settlers, often by granting or selling land cheaply. Over time, all the land was taken from the native people and passed into some public but mostly private lands, leaving the trustees today as stewards of what remains public: our beaches, bays, harbors, and a handful of roads. Wainscot remains a debated name. Some trace it to wainscot, a method of preparing oak boards for this kind of architecture here, an early export from that region. Historian David Gardner, however, suggested it may derive from an indigenous word, Wainscot. I even asked a few wainscot dumplings, that's a nickname for wainscot locals, and they weren't sure either. Then there's the name Gardner, which appears everywhere. Gardner Avenue, Gardner Street, Gardner Brown House, Gardner's Bay, and on and on. Most of us know the story. Lion Gardner was among the earliest and arguably most influential figures in East Hampton's founding. He settled Gardner's Island in 1639, an island known before to native peoples as Monchinook. Translation, Island of the Dead. Named so because smallpox wiped out an entire village of Montaukets. Lion renamed the island Isle of Wight, a name that survives today as Isle of Wight Road in Springs. Of course, now we call it Gardner's Island. Gardner played a key role in establishing the East Hampton colony, and his descendants today number in the thousands. Robert David Lion Gardner, the last Gardner to bear the family name, once described his ancestors' first survey of the island this way: when he first walked over it, he found magnificent forests, saltwater ponds, and fresh streams that he could dam and use for livestock. Lion Gardner held a royal grant from King Charles I, and incredibly, this island remains in the same family to this day. I've actually been on the island. One time, a group of friends and I made the questionable decision to go ashore in search of the plaque marking where Captain Kidd's treasure was found. And there is a plaque. That adventure ended quickly. Before we knew it, we were rounded up by Robert Gardner's nephew. We were loaded up in the back of a wagon, hitched to a four-wheeler, and politely but firmly returned to the beach where our sailboat was anchored. What stayed with me, though, was the sound. The sheer volume of birds and their calls was almost overwhelming. It was like a jungle. And I remember there were loads of box turtles walking around. It was clear whose island it still was. These days, I'm actually friends with the island's manager, a tough, no-nonsense retired chief petty officer and 21-year-old veteran of the Coast Guard. I told him I was giving this talk and asked if there were any juicy news worth sharing. There's not a chance. His response was something like, security has been significantly beefed up. The island's shores are strictly protected, not only to ensure the owner's privacy, but because the island serves as a bird sanctuary for several threatened and endangered species. In other words, I strongly advise against any explorations. All right, and if you're hoping to pay your respects to Lion, you're in luck. He rests not on Gardner's Island, but just down the street here at the old South End Cemetery. Barcelona Neck towards Sag Harbor earned its name because its bluffs reminded sea captains and sailors returning to Sag Harbor of the Spanish city of Barcelona. Today, of course, it's home to a golf course and a county park called Linda Grunland Memorial Park, named after Linda Grunland, a local woman who went down on Flight 93 on 9/11. Just west of Barcelona Neck is Little Northwest Creek, or otherwise known as Rattlesnake Creek, a meandering saltwater marsh that is filled with snapping turtles. Rattlesnake Creek is a reminder that the South Fork once supported timber rattlers, along with wolves and bobcats. All of them were systematically hunted to extinction by early settlers. Whooping Hollow Road climbs to one of the highest points in the Northwest and connects Sag Harbor Turnpike with Two Holes Road. According to Jeanette Edwards Rattray, Whooping Hollow was once known as Whooping Boys Hollow, a name tied to a chilling local legend. The story goes that a boy was murdered there and that his spirit lingered among the trees, frightening passerbys with eerie, whooping sounds on dark nights. I happen to live nearby, and I hear that eerie whooping sometimes at night, too. So this might be stretching it, but what people were possibly hearing is our local screech owl. If you've ever heard it, it's really unsettling. It sounds like a mix between an owl and a ghost horse. So sometimes history opens the door for folklore. Sometimes nature does the rest. Hands Creek takes its name from the Hand family, whose lineage reaches back to the Mayflower. One descendant fought under George Washington. Another, Captain David Hand, is said to have inspired Natty Bumppo, the iconic frontier hero of James Fenimore Cooper's novels. Powder Hill in Northwest is said to have been a hiding place for gunpowder during the War of 1812, when British ships blockaded Gardner's Bay. It's one of those names that quietly reminds you how close this place once was to real conflict. Cedar Point Park Peninsula was once an island known as Cedar Point Island. It became connected to the mainland during the 1938 hurricane. The Cedar Point Lighthouse, built in 1938, still stands and is being rebuilt. And that was a really important lighthouse during the heyday of the whaling industry. Hundreds of ships would pass by there every year, and there's shifting shoals. That ended during the Civil War, was the end of the whaling days. And near that area, fun fact, last year I was with my kids walking around there, and I found a quartz arrowhead. It's really beautiful if you want to come up and see it afterwards. Back in the 1600s, the first port of East Hampton was tucked in behind Cedar Point in today's Northwest Harbor, a busy little trading port in its heyday with docks and warehouses. The major road leaving that original port was called Merchant's Path. And there's still a section of Merchant's Path today off 114. Scoy's Pond in Northwest is named for Van Scoy family. Isaac Van Scoy arrived from Holland in 1757, married Mercy Edwards, and had 15 children. During the American Revolution, Van Scoy killed a British soldier who was looting his home on the Northwest Harbor. Vanscoy was taken prisoner aboard a British man-of-war anchored in Sag Harbor. He escaped while waiting trial with some help of some local friends. And the family name lives on in Phoebe's Scoy Highway, the Vanscoy Cemetery, and a bunch of other places. You'll notice a surprising number of place names in East Hampton that include the word hole. Flaggy Hole, Edwards Hole, Cranberry Hole, Kettle Hole, Two Holes of Water, Daniel's Hole. This says more about glaciers than it does about anyone's sense of humor. These aren't body parts. They're references to kettle holes, and to understand them, we have to go back to the Ice Age. As the last glacier retreated about 12,000 years ago, massive chunks of ice broke off and were left behind, buried in sand and sediment. When those blocks of ice eventually melted, they left behind depressions in the landscape, what geologists call kettle holes. Most of those filled with water, forming ponds, wetlands, low marshes, holes. In other words, when you see a hole on a map in East Hampton, you're looking at a place where the Ice Age can still be seen. Okay, as we move into East Hampton Village, I'll be showing some iconic and beautiful paintings by Thomas Moran and his wife, Mary Nemo Moran of East Hampton. Many are depicting Hook Pond, named quite simply for the hook shape, not for the infamous pirate. All right, Moran lived just down the street from here, across from Town Pond. If you haven't visited his home, you got to go. It's a place where art, architecture, and history all come together. All right, we've got Fithian Lane between Cinderella and London Jewelers. Honors William Fithian, one of East Hampton's earliest settlers. He was a Welsh soldier in Thomas Cromwell's army and was present at the execution of Charles I. When Cromwell's forces eventually fell from power, Fithian did what most defeated revolutionaries did. He fled as far as possible, ending up here. East Hampton has always been an absorbing place for people with complicated pasts. Also, some of these photos don't match up exactly with what I'm talking about. Okay? Further Lane was originally called Farther Lane, meaning simply farther from the village. Paired with Middle Lane, Hither Lane, even Town Pond, which we all know and love, was first and for a long time called Goose Pond, which tells you about its original residents. Highway behind the lots, which overlaps with Toilsome Lane, comes directly from the town's original layout. In the 1600s, East Hampton homes were long, narrow strips, or the property, with houses along Main Street and farm fields stretching north. For example, think of Dayton Lane. The Daytons own all the land along that strip from Main Street to highway behind the lots. Toilsome Lane, I thought it meant toil or work, maybe it does, but I also found it could mean till. Toil is an old word for till, meaning to plow or cultivate. Several street names honor ministers in our town, who played a big role in East Hampton's colonial days. James Lane is named for Reverend Thomas James Jr., the town's first minister. Hunting Lane honors Daniel Hunting, who arrived in 1699 as the village's second minister. The family home where 9 generations of Huntings lived became what is now the Hunting Inn and the Palms. If you've ever had a beer there, there's been a lot of people having beers in that place. Buell Lane commemorates Reverend Samuel Buell, a Yale graduate and outspoken minister during the British occupation. These pastors led what would become today the Presbyterian Church on Main Street, that beautiful white church. As the settlement grew eastward, Main Street, originally called Town Street, expanded. The extension became Newtown Lane. Pudding Hill, I have to say, named during the Revolution when our town was occupied by the British. Miss Mary Sanford Miller hurled her pudding down the hill rather than share it with British soldiers. A bicentennial plaque marks that delicious resistance. Drew Lane off Lily Pond. This photo is actually Ocean Avenue, but it's kind of the same era. Is named after the famous actor John Drew, 1853 to 1927. He was a Leonardo DiCaprio of his day who lived there. The theater at Guildhall is named after him. His niece was Ethel Barrymore, and his great-great-niece is Drew Barrymore. Wireless Road, located between Cove, Hollow Road, and Toilsome, is named after an early radio transmission station that once stood there. Towers, each about 165 feet tall, relayed messages from ships at sea to Western Union in Manhattan. The station closed in the 1930s, the towers vanished, but the name Wireless Road remained. Many people don't realize that Freetown exists at all. Located north of the railroad tracks between 3 Mile Harbor, Springs, Fireplace, and Hands Creek Road, Freetown represents an important and often overlooked chapter of East Hampton's past. Like Eastville and Sag Harbor, Freetown became a settlement of freed African Americans and Native people. Although slavery was finally abolished in New York by 1827, freedom did not come with land, security, or equal opportunity. Freetown emerged out of necessity by people who worked as sailors, farmers, laborers, and craftsmen, contributing quietly but meaningfully to the life of East Hampton. Remembering Freetown matters. It reminds us that East Hampton's history is broader and more complex than we often assume, and that is some of its most important stories are the ones that are overlooked. Freetown also became an important enclave for Montaukett people, and that history is important to acknowledge. One reason traces back to the 1800s when Arthur Benson, a powerful real estate developer, acquired vast tracts of land in Montauk. In the process, land grants were offered to Montaukett families, often in places like Freetown or farther west up island, in exchange for land in Montauk. How those transactions occurred and how freely they were made remain deeply controversial. It's a history shaped by unequal power, legal pressure, and a rapidly changing landscape where indigenous people were being pushed off ancestral land through paperwork rather than force. The legacy of that period still lingers today, which is why names like Benson Drive, Benson Reserve appear throughout Montauk. And of course, the Montaukett Nation is still fighting to be fully recognized again. Springs. This is kind of a cool map. It's the school districts. Not the Springs, just Springs. Takes its name from the many freshwater springs scattered throughout the area. Early settlers included the Chatfields, Hands, Bakers, Millers, Bennetts. Water once dictated where people lived, farmed, and gathered, and Springs is a prime example of how geography shapes settlement. Until well into the 20th century, Springs was, by Long Island standards, truly remote, a self-sufficient community of farmer, fishermen centered around Accabonac Harbor. I've spent countless summers out on that harbor, leading kayak tours and explaining its history to visitors who arrive expecting a quiet paddle and leave realizing they've been floating through centuries of working waterfront. As I mentioned earlier, Accabonac is a Montauk word with an important legacy. Over time, it evolved into the word Bonacker, and I know we have a few here tonight. Today, that term usually means someone born and raised in Springs. But historically, a Bonacker was someone who worked the harbor, fishing, clamming, oystering, doing the hard, wet work that sustained the community. It also served as a quiet social distinction. Bonackers were the plain, working people, as opposed to the upstreeters who lived in the village and dressed in fancier clothes. I was born in Southampton Hospital, grew up on Dayton Lane, went to East Hampton High School with our Bonacker mascot, but I know I still don't qualify as a true Bonacker. And the Cataletto name doesn't help. Accabonac Highway, one of East Hampton's earliest roads, cut deliberately to provide access to the salt meadows surrounding the harbor. On July 5th, 1653, those meadows were divided among the town's founders. The salt hay, Spartina grass, was one of the most valuable resources they had. Cut in late summer and dried, it was used for winter livestock feed and bedding. It also served another purpose. Along with seaweed, it was packed into the walls of homes for insulation. The salt content made it actually naturally fire resistant and vermin proof. And so if you've ever renovated an old house in Springs, you've probably seen this poking out. In fact, to this day, at low tide, at the end of Landing Lane, off Old Stone Highway, you can still see part of what's known as the Corduroy Trail, partially buried in the marsh. Built in the 1700s, this was part of an elaborate network of cut logs laid side by side across the Accabonock marshlands. This network of wooden roads allowed horses and wagons harvesting hay to crisscross the wetlands without sinking into the mud. So go to Landing Lane at low tide, you'll see this. It's incredible. Next up, 3 Mile Harbor is named quite literally. The early village of East Hampton sat roughly 3 miles from the head of the harbor. I've also heard it's 3 miles long, but it's 2.3 miles, so I'm not going with that one. Dominy Lane honors Dominy family, one of East Hampton's founding families, famous for furniture, making clocks, windmill building. And if you've ever been to Hook Mill, one of our most iconic landmarks, the one in the center of the village, built by Nathaniel Dominy, it feels like you're in a giant clock, right, with all the cogs and the gears. So they would build the tiny clocks, but then the same idea on these windmills. Fireplace Road, Fireplace Landing mark an area in Springs where signal fires were once lit to alert Gardiner's Island that someone wished to cross the bay. Lyon Gardner owned land here and built a storehouse, and over time the area became a small commercial hub. Lion's Head, community. The area was named after a dangerous, large rock in the shape of a lion's head that just comes out of the water at low tide, becoming a hazard to mariners every high tide. It has sunk many ships over the centuries. It's right around this corner where a lot of ships will, cut through. Louse Point, a sandy peninsula on Accabonock Harbor, has competing origin stories. One claims fishermen from Connecticut caught so few fish that someone joked there weren't enough to feed a louse. Another suggests livestock brought to Gardiner's Island was deloused in the water there to prevent disease. Either way, not exactly a name that would bring in some tourism, right? Okay, Soakhides Roads makes a historic leather working site where cowhides were soaked to soften them for tanning. This goes back to pre-colonial days. Today the area is a 34-acre open space wetlands preserve, nature reclaiming industry. Heading farther east into the hamlet of Amagansett, we run into a few names that are especially revealing. We got Bunker Hill Road. This is kind of building on the idea of the Promised Land. The Promised Land was named for these fish factories that were there. And it used to smell terrible, so they said it smelled to high heavens. Nearby Bunker Hill Road, kind of the same idea. This gentleman, this farmer, spread bunker all over his hillside field, neglected to plow it under. The smell lingered long enough to call it Bunker Hill Road, not after the American Revolution. The name Talkhouse shows up all over East Hampton. That's a Mahaden or a bunker fish. They're actually coming back in strength now. You can see them off the beaches, right? Bringing all the sharks. All right, we got to do Stephen Talkhouse. Stephen Farrow, better known as Stephen Talkhouse, a larger-than-life Montaukett man whose story deserves to be remembered. He served the 29th Connecticut Volunteers during the Civil War, sailed on whaling voyages around the world, and later became East Hampton's town messenger and a mail carrier. He was famous for covering 30 to 50 miles a day on foot, way before all of us had to get our steps in. His funeral was held at St. Michael's Chapel in Freetown. He was laid to rest on Indian Field in Montauk. And speaking of Montauk, let's head out there one last time before I finish up. Let's start with a few beach names. Amsterdam Beach, about 2 miles west of Montauk. Lighthouse takes its name from the steamer Amsterdam, which wrecked there in 1867. As with many of Montauk's coastal names, a single dramatic event left a permanent mark on the map. Farther along is Coconuts, a stretch of beach between Ditch Plains and Montauk Point. The name comes from the wreck of the schooner Elise Fay in the winter of 1893. Its cargo, coconuts, washed ashore in the thousands. Locals, never ones to waste a good opportunity, helped themselves. For a brief moment in Montauk history, coconuts were plentiful, free, and served in a wide variety of dishes for every meal of the day. Culloden Point, and the name, there's some other names, Culloden Points in Montauk, comes from the shipwreck of the British man of war that went aground there on a stormy night in 1791 during the American Revolution when they were stationed Cherry Harbor in Gardiner's Island. And you can still see at low tide, you can actually still snorkel out to that wreck. I want to show you another map of Montauk. These are all popular surf breaks and also known as surf casters as well. Many of these go back to some old shipwrecks, landmarks, long forgotten events. I've surfed a lot of these spots. Each one could easily be a subject of its own history talk. And this is not a complete list. There's some secret spots like Poles or Ranch that I will not reveal. But I just want to kind of read them. If you can't see me in the back, they're just kind of cool to hear. So Hither Hills, Parkline, Gurney's, Transformers, Dead Man's Cove, Ditch Plains, Trailer Park, Cavitts Cove, Churches, Coconuts, Tumas, Casewells Beach, Kings Point, Sewer, Browns, Turtle Cove, Lighthouse, Scott's Hole, Bluffs, Jones's Reef, False Bar, North Bar, Clark Cove, Split Rock, Shagwan, Gin Beach, Culloden. And you can just see the contours of the point there. Depending on the swell and the surf and the wind, a good surfer can always find a wave somewhere out in Montauk. And of course, the biggest transformation of all came much later with the rise of the automobile, which reshaped not just the land, but the pace of life itself. Today we move quickly across hundreds of paved roads that were once footpaths, cart tracks. As the population grew, more roads were cut, more land developed, and many open places disappeared. As I wrap up tonight, I want to leave you with one simple idea that runs quietly beneath all these names. We live in a place shaped by deep time and fast time. Deep time gave us glaciers, marshes, trails that slowly became roads, rising water. Fast time gives us traffic, schedules, and the idea that whatever we see today will surely be there tomorrow. Most changes happen quietly. Names fade, marshes shrink, species disappear. If we're paying attention, sometimes return. The osprey is a good reminder of that. Once nearly extinct due to pesticides, now back because people took notice, adjusted, and acted. And today, the osprey is everywhere again because we cared. The original people who named this place understood it by watching it closely. Their names weren't poetic for poetry's sake. They were practical, observant, and earned. Sagaponack, Accabonac, Amagansett, Shagwan, Montauk. They tell us what the land does, not what we wish it to do. And the good news, paying attention still works. Knowing a place well enough to name it, to care for it, it's the first step to keeping it and protecting it. We're not just inheritors of this landscape, we're temporary caretakers. What that really means is doing a few simple things well, supporting land preservation, respecting wetlands and shorelines, keeping fertilizers and chemicals out of our groundwater, giving wildlife space and passing on local knowledge, especially to the next generation. Thanks for all the students here tonight. It means remembering that places don't stay beautiful by accident. They stay that way because people like us decide again and again that they matter. So thanks so much for all of you for being here tonight and caring about our town, its history, and its next chapter. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I'm going to give a quiz, like I said. Also, I'm just going to leave my email up. I love to talk history. If you have a question or if I was totally wrong, shoot me an email. I also just finished a young adult historical fiction book, and it's coming out this spring called Kings of the Coast Montauk. I'm really excited about it. So if you email me, I would love to try and get you a copy of that book. All right, here we go. Okay, here we go. Now the quiz. Just yell it out. It's not like school where you have to raise your hand. All right, what does Paumanok mean? I'm sorry. What does Paumanok mean? The island of Tribute. Good. What was Town Pond originally called? right. What's another name for Mahayden? Bunker. Bunker, all right. True or false? Rattlesnakes once lived in East Hampton.
True.
What war did Stephen Talkhouse fight in? Civil War. You all passed, all right. Congrats. Thank you.